In this video, I want to discuss the box model, padding, borders, margins, and the box sizing property. I'm working in Coffee Cup because I want to use the external preview window. I'll close this for a second. If you want to use the preview window, pull down the view menu and you can use it in a couple of ways. Right now it's in the split screen preview, but that's not going to show me enough what I want to show you. And so I'm going to use the external preview window. And the nice thing about this is it will reflect the changes that I'm making in my code without me having to save them. And gives you the opportunity to try things before you commit to saving. So this is the file that I've given you. This is what it looks like. It's not a thing of beauty, but it's just for demonstration purposes. I have 3 divs. All 3 of the divs have been given a width of 500 pixels. By default, the width property of an element includes only the width of the content and does not include padding and borders. Now, where does that come from? That actually comes from this property here called box sizing, and the default value is content box. So again, if I set a width to be 500 pixels, that includes only the width of the content. If I add any padding or borders, it's going to make the overall size width of the box larger, and that's what I want to demonstrate to you here. So I'm going to go to div 2, and here's my code. I've already got an inline style set up. I'm using the shorthand notation of 2 values for padding. First one being top and bottom, the second one being left and right. I'm just going to set some padding for the left and right. And I will set 25 pixels. Now you watch the preview window. As soon as I set 25 pixels of padding, you notice I get padding. Remember, that's the space between the border and the content. So there's 25 pixels here and 25 here. Notice how the overall width of the div has now increased. In addition, if I add 25 pixels of margin to the top and bottom, remember, margin is the distance between adjacent elements. So I've added 25 pixels to the top and the bottom. Margin is the space outside of the element. Okay, in the third div, I want to demonstrate this concept of vertical margins collapsing. So you know that we already have 25 pixels of margin on div 2. On div 3, I'm going to add 50 pixels of margin. Now you might have expected, since we already had 25 pixels on div 2 and then added 50 pixels to div 3, that you would expect to see 75 pixels of space here. But you don't. What you see is 50. Notice the 50 pixels down here and this distance are the same. And that's because of this concept of vertical margins collapse. So when you have vertical margins on adjacent elements, the smaller margin just sort of folds into the larger margin. And you end up with just, in this case, 50 here and 50 here. The reason for this is that when you have stacked elements, for example, list items in a list, your navigation menu items, and you want to add margins between the elements, you don't want to have unequal spacing. And so when the vertical margins collapse, you'll get even spacing on the top and bottom of this stack of elements. Okay, now I just want to go back here to this second div And remember, we said that when we've got this set to content box, the size of the border is also not included. So let me make a really thick border on div 2. And notice that that box got even wider because of this extra 30 pixels of border that I've got here. 15 on the left and 15 on the right. In this chapter, you're learning how to float elements, float them next to each other, and they may very well be contained within a wrapper. If the width of your divs is affected by the size of the border, the padding that you put on there, it can get a little unwieldy when you're trying to float divs around each other. So what I want to do now is demonstrate a different value for box sizing, and I'll leave the padding and the margins on here, and I'm just going to go up to the box sizing property and change this. Instead of the default content, I'm going to change this to border box. Did you notice what happened to div 2? It's no longer wider than the other divs. Instead, by setting box sizing to border box, we've said we want the overall size of the box to be 500 pixels, and that is going to include not only the content, but also the padding and the border. To demonstrate that further, let me go back to div 2 and make that really thick border. And you notice the width of div 2 is still only 500 pixels. Instead, what happened to accommodate the text, the height of the div got taller. So now that you're learning how to float elements, setting the box sizing property to border box is the preferred value. And notice that what we've done here is we've used the asterisk, which is a universal selector, so that this box sizing border box value will be applied to all elements.